Hey, I'm Cam from Cortex Collider Studios, and this is the first developer diary for Firekeep. We showed off a demo of Firekeep at the Steam Next Fest in October, so about a month ago from where I'm recording this now, and we got a lot of really interesting feedback. Previously, we'd just been sharing it with friends and family, and this was the first time that we'd actually, put it out to the world. And we got a lot of feedback that we did expect. It is still pretty rough around the edges, but we got some feedback that, really made us question, like, what do we want to do with this game? What is this game going for? And how do we go about doing that? And believe it or not, it all came from a question about bad UI. But first I should probably explain what Firekeep even is. Firekeep is a chill, replayable city builder about building a sustainable city on a little floating island in space. You build buildings on these hexes, and then they can send and receive resources with their neighbors. They upgrade, they make more resources, and it's up to you to mix and match to create the best combinations without running out of oxygen. You win by upgrading your center tile to the maximum level, which you can see in that little top right corner. Then, once you've done it, you roll a new island and you play it again. But before I can talk about where we're going with this project, I think I got to give you a little history on where we've been. The design has shifted considerably, and I think that's kind of the root of a lot of our problems. So this is an old build of Firekeep, back when we were all about these dots. Originally the idea was that you would designate certain tiles for certain things, and then your little villagers over here would build stuff on them afterwards. So you weren't necessarily in direct control, but kind of. And let me tell you, nobody liked it. We've also cut the villagers. Their sound effects were incredibly annoying. They'd get lost, and they were really just cosmetic, and they were more trouble than they were worth. So they're gone. From the failed dots experiment, the design's been pretty consistent. We briefly experimented with only having one resource and just buildings needing increasingly rarer and rarer resources to upgrade. As you can imagine, that's kind of frustrating for the player to have to keep track of almost as many resources as there are buildings. So we scrapped that in favor of combinations because they're easier, they're more flexible, they allow mixing and matching because there's more input and output sources. We wanted the game to be exploratory, and we felt that the combination system was a lot more forgiving, which leads us to where we are today. So in the current system of Firekeep, what happens is if you have, for instance, a building that produces a resource and a neighbor that needs the resource, the system automatically sends it. We figured, make it accessible, make it casual. We don't want the player doing no-brainer busy work at all. However, it forced into a couple design ramifications that I think ultimately hurt the game. And the first one is this resource choice thing. We have to pause the game when there's a choice to be made, essentially, if it's not an easy choice. To me, that was something to be avoided. No one likes doing the first start of a Sudoku where you have to put all the little numbers and all the little boxes and all that sort of stuff. That kind of leads us to where we're at right now. I've zoomed in on a small settlement that kind of highlights the problems that we have with using the UIs that were set up for a much less information-dense system, especially now we've got these connections and this building menu. It is incredibly tough to see what's going on here. So, all that in mind, where's the first place to start implementing some of this feedback? Well, number one, I think we have to get rid of this tiny UI. It moves around, it overlaps the already cramped UI, and we have so much extra real estate that around the sides of the board that is just background and stars that we could put to better use. So we've taken this guy out and we've replaced him with this big sidebar. Most importantly, he's got a little extra room for new features. Like, for instance, you can see how many resources that the building has, how many it's locked in for upgrades already, and how many it's got but hasn't used in case, I don't know, maybe you want a refund. So that's good, but what about this? It's like if the Catan guy threw up. So it's becoming increasingly apparent that this isn't just a UI problem, it's a whole game problem. And that's a much bigger problem to solve. But there is one framework that I find useful that I first heard in an episode of Coffee with Butterscotch, which is a podcast by the guys who did Crashlands and Levelhead. I can't recommend it enough. check it out if you haven't already. But essentially, in one of their episodes, they call this system the Whiff to Nail range. Just basically is a good way to evaluate any kind of piece of media is how well do you think it achieved what it was going for. For instance, if you saw a Western movie that didn't have the guns, shootouts, and general frontier lawlessness that you might have expected from the posters or the trailer or something like that, you might feel that, the movie didn't deliver on some of its key promises. Likewise, if you played a Call of Duty game and there was no, guns, shootout, or general lawlessness, you might also feel like, it didn't really live up to the promises of the franchise. So, right off the bat, how does Firekeep live up to its promises? Like, what are we promising, and how does our UI and mechanics support that? To put it another way, Tanya Short from KitFox had a really good Twitter thread that succinctly summed up this idea as satisfy your players' first impressions. And I'm sure you can think about a lot of overhyped games that, maybe didn't quite live up to that first impression, but it can even happen in tiny little ways. She talks about how one of her studio's games just had a bit of a disconnect between what it was going for and what people thought it was going for. And then once they kind of cleaned up and changed the messaging around the game, nothing to do with the game, people started liking it more just because it is a two-part process. Originally, the key design goal was these chain reactions, like building this system of resources and then watching them kind of ping-pong around and cascade like, Peggle or one of those early Grow Flash games, if you remember those. However, after, getting feedback from the Next Fest and getting some City Builder genre fans' hands on it, they overwhelmingly told us that they wanted control. They didn't like the automatic aspect of it. They wanted to get in the weeds and make sure that they had their stuff just right. And when you think about it, that is the key promise of a city builder genre. The whole thing is about having control. All right, so after all that analysis, all that soul searching, what does it mean for Firekeep the game? Well, with a heavy heart, I think I'm going to have to scrap my automatic allocation system. People didn't really like it, and I can see why, and even on a design level, making everything manual is a much more elegant solution to complexity. Instead of having to make this incredibly complex, system that will anticipate the player's needs, we should just let the player experiment with the fundamental activity of the game, which is allocating resources, and we should make allocating resources feel really, really good. It also works as a tutorializer. Like, instead of having to learn and figure out this complicated system, just drop resources on it, see what happens, experiment. And that way, when the crazy chain of cascading elements and all that sort of stuff finally happens, the player feels so much better because guess what? They did it. Not some weird robot playing by weird rules. So that's, I think, the first thing. And fundamentally, I think that means a huge shift in how Firekeep looks and plays. What does that mean for the UI? Well, let's break it down by top level and lower level UI. Essentially, top level is something that's always on screen because it is deeply related to the core loop or the fundamental action that you're doing. Think bullet counters for something like Call of Duty, resources for something like StarCraft or Age of Empires, mana crystals for Hearthstone. All those things are top level UI because they tell the player how much ability the player has to do the fundamental actions. Shooting people, building units or buildings, and playing or summoning creatures and cards, right? It's pretty key. They let you know how much and for how long you can do the action. Whereas something like, changing your gun's attachment for Call of Duty, training specific units, or examining a unit's or a card's keywords and stuff like that, that lives in a secondary UI that you either have to hover over or click into to access. And so basically, based on our prior analysis, we need to determine what the key action of Firekeep is. or with the key action that our audience expects. And I would argue that's allocating resources. It's a game about building a city and efficiently planning things, and we want to give you more control over that because that's the key action of the game. So the only thing that is always on screen is going to be these little pop-ups, these stacked resources, and they're only going to be the extra resources that a building has. Refunds, connections, upgrades, all that sort of stuff, it can live in the sidebar, it can live in a hover menu, but right now this game is about efficiently allocating resources. So you should always have your excess resources to be allocated on the screen. It's the key action. And now that it's manual, you can stockpile them, you can stack them, you can choose when to spend them. It opens up a lot more interesting decisions for the player. Hopefully, at least. All that being said, this might not be a silver bullet for all of Firekeep's woes, but we really hope it's a step in the right direction. And in the meantime, while we are going back to work on it, we'd like to hear what you guys think. There is, right now, an updated demo on Firekeep's Steam page with all of the UI improvements and changes that I've just been talking about. Go take a look, let me know what you guys think, either here in the YouTube comments or on the Steam community page. All we ask is that you do keep your comments civil and respectful and, in good faith. Also, as the design team, we do appreciate all feedback that we get, but we are going to make the final call, not because we don't think you guys don't have great suggestions, but more because we're more in tune with the whole budget and project side, and we know when we start to run out of money. All right, well, depending on how people like this one, there might be more in the future. I'm going to try and update it whenever something interesting or worth talking about shows up in this project, but no promises, and also definitely no set schedule. Until next time, maybe, enjoy the demo, guys.